Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and usually in this spot, I just do a very brief introduction to the podcast. However, for once, I found a bit of money in the budget just to bring Tom Hanks in to give us a few motivational words.
How do we sift truth from belief? How do we write our own histories, personally or culturally, and thereby define ourselves? How do we penetrate years, centuries of historical distortion to find original truth? Tonight, this will be our quest.
You're not wrong, Tom. You're not wrong. Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
And the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, that's all you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, the title's given it away, really. I'm here to talk of the stories of films, and I tend to talk about development stories, production stories, release stories, marketing stories, religious protest stories, all those ingredients that go towards making the films that we know and sometimes love. Just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. Now, the films that I tend to cover in this podcast lean more towards the mainstream than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I'm trying not to do snark. I'm trying not to punch down. This podcast is a celebration of cinema and a real appreciation of the fact it's really hard to get a film made. Without further ado, I think it's enough preamble. I just want to get on with the first of the two films I'm going to talk about in this episode. Now, I'm taking you back to 2002 for this one. I'm just going to play you a taste of the trailer. I'll come to the story the other side of this.
What can make geometric shapes the size of a football field?
What kind of machine can bend a stalk of corn over without breaking it?
Can't be by hand, it's too perfect.
So the aliens can't read our minds.
Oh.
Some animals around the county have been acting funny. Some of them violent. It's almost like they act when they smell a predator around.
Amman, Nairobi, Bangalore, and Jerusalem as the
Same
latest.
shows on every station.
Every station?
It is the 18th reported crop site in that country in the last 72 hours.
I'm a little scared. All this stuff on TV. Joe Gills was in here talking about the end of the world.
They're staying in the shed.
And that, of course, is a clip from 2002 Signs, written and directed by M Night Shyamalan, starring Mel Gibson, Joaquin Phoenix, Rory Culkin, Abigail Breslin in her first role, Cherry Jones, and, of course, M Night Shyamalan. He pops up in this movie as well. So, our story here starts in the aftermath of the release of 2000's Unbreakable, which cemented Shyamalan's position as the breakthrough box office champion, really. That in 1999, he'd put together The Sixth Sense, which he wrote and directed, and I've covered it before on Film Stories, went on to make an enormous amount of money and also earned Oscar nominations as well. Now, Unbreakable, which arrived the following year, starring Samuel L. Jackson, didn't enjoy quite the same level of success, but it still had its fans, and I think it's a film that's endured and it's found a growing fan base in the aftermath of its release. But it made money again, and his films weren't costing an awful lot of money. He was coming up with movies that people were wanting to go to the cinema to see, and so by the time he was coming round to his next production, I mean, any studio in town really was going to write him a cheque. Now, in the aftermath, again, of the release of Unbreakable, there was talk about doing an Unbreakable 2, and in fact, there was talk of a trilogy even at one stage, and it's only in more recent times would that be realised. But this was not going to be his next film, because come the early 2000s, and in fact the late 1990s as well, and the phenomenon of crop circles was in the news. That news outlets were delighting in showing pictures of these mysterious circles that were appearing in cornfields, and this was something that came to Shyamalan's attention, as he would explain to Entertainment Weekly in an interview. He said, "I love the idea of this big prank going on all over the world." But then he took it a bit further. He said, "I thought, what if there's there's another meaning behind them. And this was a catalyst, really, for his next story. And he got to work on a script about a lapsed minister and a widowed father of two who was living on a younger farm with his younger brother when crop circles suddenly start appearing in his cornfields. Now, Shyamalan has talked in the past. I mean, he did an extensive retrospective interview with the outlet The Ringer for this, which I do recommend digging out. And he talked about how he only really deals with one film at a time, that there are some filmmakers who are juggling 7 or 8 projects at any one go. But with Shyamalan, it was becoming a bit sequential, really, that he concentrates on the one, then moves on to the next. And he admitted that Signs, to a degree, was a reaction to the response he got to Unbreakable. Because whereas The Sixth Sense had taken off and had got rave reviews, there was quite a lot of backlash, really, against Unbreakable at the point it was released. And he explained to The Ringer, I had a complicated reaction to Unbreakable. And as he explained, he said, I wanted to make a movie about comic books, and it wasn't a time when anybody was interested in seeing movies about comic books. In fact, it was not seen as a legitimate subject matter. And so instead, he got in touch with Disney, where he'd made The Sixth Sense and Unbreakable, and told the studio that he wanted to make a film, quote, that is just joyous and doesn't have that lens of burden on it. And he says it was going to be a film with a lot of conflict in it, but he wanted the voice and the angle of that story to be inspired and childlike. He wanted to do a family story. He wanted to do something a bit more upbeat. And so he got into writing, but he approached the writing of Signs in a different way to the manner in which he'd written The Sixth Sense. His screenplay for Stuart Little as well, that had come out in 1999, that film. He didn't direct it, but it was another hit with his name on it, and also Unbreakable. But this time he was only going to write when he was feeling light. That rhymes. But he was looking to be in a good mood at the point that he was putting words down on his screen. And he would describe Signs as the easiest script he'd written in his career at that point. Because what he was doing was he was putting his fun ideas in. He was writing the film when he was in a good mood. And a renowned cineast, he was drawing on references. I mean, he drew on the work of Alfred Hitchcock as touch points for the film he was looking to put together. The Birds, for instance, is one of the films that he drew inspiration from. And it took on and off about half a year to get the screenplay to Signs in a position he was happy with. And what he'd put together was a mix of the crop circle movie, and whether that was a big prank, and a sort of end of the world film as well. And so by the spring of 2001, he could put this out to market because Signs was a script written on spec. A studio hadn't paid for its development. The risk was incumbent on Shyamalan at that point, although it wasn't a massive risk. But as always with a spec script, you send it out to market and you hope that people will just buy it off the shelf. And this one caused a lot of interest in Hollywood, as you would expect. Shyamalan's track record at this point was box office gold. And so by April of 2001, it was Disney that outbid the rest of Hollywood, that the script had gone out to auction. And Variety reported that Disney inked an 8-figure deal for the film. The exact number was never revealed, but it was not going to be cheap. That a script and presentation had gone out on a Saturday. The deal was closed within days. And Shyamalan, bottom line of this, was not going to be short of a few quid. And it's, an interesting evolution of his relationship with Disney, because infamously with The Sixth Sense, an executive at Disney had so little confidence in the project, it sold off a massive stake of that film, and as the money poured in, Disney would just get a fraction of the earnings, and in this case it wanted it all for itself. So Shyamalan had his script, he had the deal with Disney to fund the movie and to release the movie, and quickly actually pre-production on this could get underway because there was some physical demands on this one. That, as always, Shyamalan was going to look to film this in and around Philadelphia in Pennsylvania, and it was Bucks County where the production was going to be mainly sited. But this required cornfields, it required corn to be grown, and there was a little bit of work that needed to be done beforehand and a bit of planning, because what Shyamalan didn't want to do was over-rely on visual effects for some of the key moments of the film. Now, while the corn was growing, the casting could get underway. And so, it became pretty well known that this film was happening and agents were sending details through to Shyamalan. But the star of the film would be Mel Gibson, yet he would not be the first choice for that lead role, because as the once prominent website Ain't It Cool News reported, Shyamalan originally intended for the lead to be an older actor. And so to that end, Paul Newman was approached about the part, and he took a look at it, decided this is not for me, he turned the role down. Next on the list was reportedly Clint Eastwood. And Eastwood was sounded out. He was having a very good time with his career at this point. And he was a bit more interested from what I can glean. But the problem with Eastwood is he's always working on something. And true to form, he was committed to other projects and thus had to turn Signs down. And eventually it got to the point where, well, Mel Gibson seemed like a logical choice. And just in terms of historical context, at this stage, he hadn't set fire to his career. That various controversies surrounding Gibson hadn't come to light. And he was one of the more reliable and bankable leading stars in Hollywood. So here we now had an M. Night Shyamalan film with Mel Gibson linked with the lead. And Gibson was interested. He had to adhere to the veil of secrecy over the project and the script, that he wasn't able to hold on to the script. He just read it and completely taken with it. And Shyamalan would adjust the film slightly because now his leading character was slightly younger. But Gibson was very, very much in, and the film of Signs was coming together at some speed. Now, moving on to June of 2001, I mean, Shyamalan was a huge fan of the brilliant film You Can Count on Me, and it really is a brilliant film as well from Kenneth Lonergan. So much so that he dug into the cast of You Can Count on Me for the cast for his new movie. In particular, he picked up two actors that he wanted to cast in Signs. The first was an upcoming actor called Mark Ruffalo. I wonder what happened to him. And so he duly came in, signed on the dotted line. Rory Culkin as well also came in from You Can Count on Me, and also Cherry Jones was brought across. She was cast in the film as well, and Abigail Breslin, as I mentioned before, this was her movie breakthrough role, very young at this point. And so Disney was looking at this stage with the cast coming together at requisite speed for a winter 2002 release seemed logical, but then it also became clear this could all be a little quicker than that. And now it had Mel Gibson as well. Well, this looked like a summer movie star film all of a sudden. And the fact that Shyamalan was looking to do so much of it physically rather than digitally, as was more commonplace at the start of the 2000s, meant that the post-production of the film was unlikely to be massively extensive as well. And so a summer 2002 release not only seemed viable, it just seemed the logical thing to do. And so Disney duly adjusted its plans. But just before the start of production, there was one more casting hurdle that the film had to negotiate, because if you've seen Signs, you'll know that Mark Ruffalo isn't in it. 1 week before the start of filming, he certainly was. And then, you ready for this, he picked up a serious ear infection that required surgery. The infection was caused by a minor cyst in his inner ear, and it needed surgery. He had to have an operation, and the operation was successful and his recovery was sound, but it meant that it just knocked him out of being able to take on the film, that the recovery period would just interfere with that, and so Ruffalo couldn't do it. Who then could jump in at very short notice? Well, Joaquin Phoenix's career was not at the level it is now, certainly, and he took the call. And within a week of Mark Ruffalo dropping out, and with a week to go before the start of production as well, Joaquin Phoenix was recruited to take on the role in the movie that you see him in. And this was with a 9-week shoot that had been set to start in the middle of September, that they got these 100 acres of cornfields that had been leased to the production by a college, Delaware Valley College, and the crop circles had been put in as well. And here we were at the very last minute with a key piece of casting of the film just coming very, very quickly together. Now, before he'd started shooting the movie, Shyamalan had also storyboarded the film frame by frame. He'd written it, he'd storyboarded it, he knew what he wanted to get. He was going to continue with the veil of secrecy that he wanted to draw over the project. He wanted to protect the secrets of his movie. And it was on September the 13th of 2001 that filming would finally begin on Signs on location. But It was a somber start to the shoot, because this was a day or two after the tragic events of September the 11th that were casting a shadow over the world, really, at this point. And the film recognised it, the filmmakers recognised it as well. Before the first shot of the film, the actors and the crew held a mini vigil holding candles and then got on with the first shot of the movie. But there it was, just in the background, the evolving history of the world going on while they were on set on a cornfield making this movie that was going to be released into a very different world a year down the line. Shyamalan, though, would get into a state of mind where he could enjoy the making of this more. And he would explain in an interview, actually, he said, with Signs, everything just made me giggle. And he said, you get lines like Joaquin's, Phoenix's line, where he says, besides the possibility of an Olympic-level runner that ran around, what are some other possibilities? And Shyamalan was just enjoying it as well. And he was enjoying the shooting of those lines, and he was getting the giggles with it. And he said, even the way you do the revelations are meant to make you giggle. And this kind of light undertone to the film. He says, Joaquin's in a closet watching the creature when it first comes on. I'm going very spoiler light there. And he backs up into the clothes, and he was just determined to have a lot more fun with Signs compared to the harder productions of both The Sixth Sense and Unbreakable. Now, this was the era as well where websites were tracking the progress of films. We were just ahead of social media. God, what halcyon days that are. But there were a couple of fan sites that sprung up of Signs. In fact, there's a UK one still around as well, where you can see that, because this was primarily a location shoot, even though they had some closed sets for the movie, there are lots of pictures of the cast and crew in and around the local community where the film was shooting. There was lots of speculation as to what the film actually was. And there was a lot of, there were things put in place just to protect the secrecy of the film. So, for instance, the scripts were being printed on red paper to stop them being able to go through a photocopier. And, well, they could still go through a photocopier, but you wouldn't be able to read the output of it. Now, it didn't stop some details leaking online. In October 2011, for instance, a few weeks after filming had begun, there were script details that were coming out, but it was nothing really that would damage the movie, and the tracking of the film was really quite supportive. I mean, it's interesting going back through one of those old vintage sites that is tracking the film, that it's very much on its side. That had it been tracked over social media in more modern times, you would imagine it might be slightly more snarky, but there was genuine interest in what Shyamalan was going to be up to next. And so it got to, the last shot was in the can on November the 29th of 2001. And again, because it was this practical shoot, post-production on Signs was going to be relatively straightforward, and Shyamalan would describe it, and has described it more recently as well, as one of the easiest shoots of his career, if not the easiest shoot of his career. And it's interesting that at the point this has been recorded, he's on the eve of releasing his new film, Knock at the Door, and he's drawn parallels with the making of Signs and the tone of Signs already in the interviews for that particular film. So post-production was ongoing. One thing that didn't have to be done extensively in post-production was a score for the film. Now, Shyamalan was collaborating with James Newton Howard once again, as he had done on his last couple of films, to put together the score for Signs. But unusually, Newton Howard had completed the score for the film effectively by the time shooting had begun. Because what happened is Shyamalan took those storyboards I mentioned before, and he took the composer right the way through the story of the film over several hours, explaining the storyboards, explaining what was going to happen, and just let the composer go off and write the music that he felt would suit that without having the exact footage on a screen in front of him to refer to. The storyboards was his guide on that, but it did mean by the time they came to edit the film together, the music was ready in place. They were looking for kind of a Bernard Herrmann kind of feel to it, and it was something really that Shyamalan would be able to edit around. The power that Shyamalan had built up at this stage as well was notable, and it did affect how Disney promoted the film Signs in the end, because whereas Unbreakable was heavily pushed as the new film from the man who brought you The Sixth Sense, Shyamalan was a little bit more concerned. He knew that Signs was a different beast. He knew tonally it was a different beast from The Sixth Sense and Unbreakable. And also he knew that he had a huge movie star in his cast as well. Now, he'd had that before with Bruce Willis in The Sixth Sense, but The Sixth Sense was sold around moments as much a trailer with the infamous line of I see dead people as it was around Bruce Willis's star. In the case of Signs, the temptation for Disney was to push this heavily off the back of Mel Gibson. But Shyamalan didn't want that. He saw this movie as more of an ensemble piece. He didn't see it as a movie star vehicle, and he was insistent to Disney that he did not want this sold as a Mel Gibson film, and that affected, say for instance, the poster. Now, the artwork for Signs is of a crop circle. You don't see the actors' faces on the key poster for the film, and this was again something that Shyamalan was pushing for, that he wanted that poster, he wanted the crop circle, he wanted to push it that way. He didn't want heavy references to The Sixth Sense in the promotional material either. And again, he got his wish on this. I think by the time it came into cinemas, most of us knew that it was from Shyamalan, and most of us knew that the films he'd worked on before. But also, it didn't lean on the successes of his previous movies as much as you might ordinarily think. An official website was launched. This was launched just as filming wrapped up, actually. And I mean, in the days when you could have fun with websites like this, they were hidden codes dotted around. And if you put in the hidden code into the website, you would unlock special sections of the website and find more and more material. But even as that was launching and that was popular as well, Shyamalan was still doing interview work where he was downplaying elements of the film and again really pushing what the film wasn't. So going back to an interview he did with Entertainment Weekly, he was insistent on that Signs is not Unbreakable. And this wasn't just as a response to the mixed response to Unbreakable. It was, he was determined that this was a different beast. He explained Signs is The Birds. Signs is Night of the Living Dead. Signs is War of the Worlds. And this was the message that he was putting across, even as Disney was putting more and more of those adverts with the crop circle out into the world. And word of mouth was very, very clearly building up. Now, what Disney had done with the release date for the film was it had put it, again, unusually in August, at a point where August was not regularly a place where you would find big movies. It was scheduled for release in the US on August the 2nd to the 4th, and it was going into a competitive summer where we were seeing the things like The Bourne Identity and Minority Report and Men in Black 2, and ironically Stuart Little 2 as well. There was a new Austin Powers film. There was Star Wars Episode 2, Attack of the Clones. And in fact, in one interview promoting Signs, Shyamalan talked about how he'd been pressured towards doing science fiction. That was what was bringing loads of money in. And so this was, if anything, a little push towards that from him. The reviews of this film, well, compared to Unbreakable, I think they were slightly more favourable, really. We weren't talking at the Sixth Sense level of acclaim, but there was a lot of acclaim for Signs. The sense of a filmmaker who knew his way around the material, who knew what he was looking to put on screen, that there was a very cinematic feel to his movie, even if he was leaning perhaps on one or two things that people felt he'd done before. I don't want to go particularly spoilery on it, but the structure of Shyamalan's films has been dissected heavily. I don't think you have to look far on the internet to find a place like that. When it came to it, though, when people were asked to buy tickets for the film, boy, did they buy them. So the film had cost, it cost Disney just to get to the screen before the marketing cost, some $72 million. Its opening weekend in the US, $60.1 million, a third massive hit on the trot for M. Night Shyamalan. I mean, Unbreakable was a massive opening, perhaps not a massive hit by the end, but certainly a successful film. And the signs for Signs were looking very, very good. I mean, it opened in top spot. It knocked Austin Powers in Goldmember off the top of the chart. That got 30 million in its second weekend. The Master of Disguise, do you remember that with Dana Carvey? I mean, that opened with $12 million before fairly swiftly disappearing. Martin Lawrence Live opened in US cinemas the same week with 27 million. There's a lot of business around. The other films around the top 10, My Big Fat Greek Wedding was in its 16th week and still in 10th place. Men in Black 2 was about. Stuart Little 2, Road to Perdition was around as well. But Signs was going to take some dislodging from the top of the box office. It would need something really big to come along the week after to do it. And so something came along really big the week after that duly dislodged it. Triple X, starring Vin Diesel, opened the week after with 44 million, as well as Spy Kids 2, 16 million, and the Clint Eastwood film that he'd been busy working on, Bloodwork, opened in 5th place. But Signs, 30 million its second weekend. It only dropped 50% of its weekend business second time round. And so not only was the film doing well, the word of mouth was strong enough to keep it high up the chart. It was second place for its third week on release, and then it did the unusual thing. It bounced back up to number 1 4 weeks into release, finally dislodging Triple X. And again, with not a lot of competition towards the end of August 2002. And it wasn't until Swim Fan came along. Do you remember Swim Fan? I always quite enjoyed that. Opened with $11 million in September the 6th, that finally Signs was back off the top of the chart. No matter, because by that point it had notched up over $200 million at the US box office. In fact, its US gross would go on to be 227 million, adding another 180 million outside of the US. The total take for Signs, $408 million. Another really significant box office result for M Night Shyamalan. Shyamalan, off the back of it, well, he would do one more film for Disney, which would be The Village, and I will come to that in a future episode of the podcast. But I found an interview he did with the site Something Awful in the mid-2000s, where he just talked about if he was asked if there's anything you'd change, and he did say my relationship with Disney. And he said, if I'd never worked with them, never agreed to be their slave, I would have made such magical and elevated movies. And he said, it's hard to put your soul into something when someone else is telling you what your soul has to be. He described that at the time that he felt his latest movie is his best. And the film that he was making around the time he was doing that promotional work was 2006's Lady in the Water that he made over at Warner Brothers. And there's a really extensive book on the making of Lady in the Water, which is well worth looking. But that would be his first commercial misfire. Still, it was a film that was clearly very close to his heart, and it was one that, by the sounds of it, Disney wasn't massively interested in making. And it would start a run for Shyamalan of films that were just made for a mix of studios. I mean, he made The Happening with Fox, he would make After Earth with Sony, but he would be in a run of films that just for quite a while failed to capture really the levels of success he'd enjoyed at the late 1990s and the start of the 2000s. And it wasn't until really he went back to low budget work, working with Universal on a film called The Visit, that came out in 2015, that his career would start to turn again. And that's when he would make Split 2 years later, and Glass after that, and Old after that. And again, at the point we're recording, Knock at the Cabin is just on the verge of release. Signs then was an itch that, by the sounds of it, Shyamalan needed to scratch at that particular time, that it was made in a happier place for him. And it's interesting hearing him talk about it when he's talking about Knock at the Cabin at the point we're recording. Is it worth digging back out? Yeah, I think it is. I think it's an interesting film. I don't think it's his finest film, but also it's a surprisingly fast turnaround film story. One of the last films really of that era that was buoyed too by movie star involvement, certainly one of the last to be buoyed by Mel Gibson's involvement. And for Shyamalan, I mean, it's a film that's been reappraised quite a lot in recent times, and perhaps it's one worth digging back out and having another look at yourself. And that brings me to the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you for listening and thank you for your time. Just going to do a couple of parish notices before we move on to the second of the films I'm talking about. Firstly, if you like this podcast and want to support it, there are 3 ways you can do so. I'm very grateful for any of these. Firstly, if you want to support us financially, if you head to patreon.com/Simon Brew, you get the podcast advert free. You tend to get the podcast early as well. You find out the gossip of what we're up to behind the scenes, and you get advance notice of our live events as well. That's patreon.com/Simon Brew. Meanwhile, costing you absolutely nothing at all is if you can subscribe to this podcast at your podcast home of choice. That helps enormously with algorithms and things like that. Likewise, leaving ideally a hugely positive review. I also have issue 40 of Film Stories magazine about to go on sale at the point this is being recorded, headlined with a big interview about the incoming British folk horror movie Unwelcome. If you go to store.filmstories.co.uk, you can find more on that. And I've got another live show coming up, this time in London on Thursday the 23rd of February at King's Place. If you head to filmstories.co.uk, you can find out how to get tickets and a bit more information on the show. But now I'm going to move to the second of the two films I'm going to talk about in this episode of Film Stories. If the first has some religious undertones and some religious themes that were certainly explored in it, well, this one comes with a lot of religious controversy. Let me take you to 2006. I'm going to play you a clip. I'll come to the story of this one the other side of this.
We are in the middle of a war to protect a secret so powerful that if revealed, it would devastate the very foundations of mankind.
Professor Langdon, the chief of police would like your assistance.
I'm not sure how much help I'm going to be here. Dear God. He did this himself in his own blood?
Is it possible?
This is a message your grandfather left you.
He left us.
Might be some kind of anagram.
Can you break it?
Demons, omens, codes, monks. Da Vinci.
And that was a clip from the 2006 film The Da Vinci Code, directed by Ron Howard. Screenplay to this one credited to Akiva Goldsman, who was adapting Dan Brown's book of the same name, and starring Tom Hanks, Audrey Tautou, Ian McKellen, Alfred Molina, Jürgen Prochnow, Paul Bettany and Jean Reno. But the story of the Da Vinci Code, of course, goes back to Dan Brown, one of the most successful authors of modern times, certainly one of the most successful fiction authors as well of modern times. And the Da Vinci Code was his 2003 novel and an absolute blockbuster, a publishing sensation, this one. It was the second book that he'd penned, centred around the character of Robert Langdon following the 2000 release Angels and Demons. But it was the Da Vinci Code that really took off and became such a huge hit that it didn't take long for Hollywood to come calling. And it's not a massive surprise either. Here was a novel, a globe-trotting adventure story that had captured tens of millions of eyeballs all around the world. And if there's something Hollywood likes, it's buying a book that's got a massive inbuilt audience for it. Now, whether the audience liked the book or not, we might come to just slightly. But the first people who came along, well, it was a man called Joel Surnow. And Joel Surnow was a producer on the television show 24, starring Kiefer Sutherland. And he got hold of a copy of the Da Vinci Code in early 2003 and read it. And he was quickly taken with the idea of buying it. And so at that stage, he thus got in touch with Imagine Entertainment, who's working with On24, and producer and co-founder Brian Grazer, and suggested that Imagine picked it up and that this would be a good foundation for the next season of the TV show 24. The other co-founder of Imagine Entertainment, director Ron Howard, for the second week running, he's making an appearance on this podcast. And there was this brief period where they considered acquiring it and adapting it into the TV show. But the thing was, I mean, first of all, Dan Brown wasn't particularly interested in that, but also the book's success had really started to kick in, and that was turning heads. And it was very clear that this would be a sale in its own right for a film in its own right as well. And the checkbooks came out. Hollywood studios started the bidding war to pick up the rights to the Da Vinci Code. And by the middle of 2003, how quick was this? A deal was done. Sony was going to be spending $6 million for the upfront rights, not just to the Da Vinci Code, but to all of the Dan Brown, Robert Langdon books. It was planning multiple films, and it wanted to get moving really, really quickly on the first of them, based on the Da Vinci Code. It wasn't going to go for Angels and Demons. That would be, even though that was the first story in the particular saga, it was going for the one that had just hit in such a massive way. And so Sony moved quickly, and by the autumn of 2003 it actually had its personnel in place as well. That Ron Howard, it was announced, was going to direct the movie, and A Beautiful Mind scribe Akiva Goldsman was going to come in and adapt the book as well. Now, Akiva Goldsman had worked with Ron Howard on A Beautiful Mind. They'd won Oscars for that. Akiva Goldsman also penned the script of Batman and Robin, for which he didn't win an Oscar. But Brian Grazer was going to produce, and after all, Imagine Entertainment came in, even though the company hadn't got it first time round, by nature of the deal with Sony, by nature of the fact that Howard had been making arguably his most underrated film, The Missing, with Sony at the time. There was a relationship in place, all the personnel was falling in, and this was a way to get the project up and running, well, quickly. Now, as with many of the tales I tell on this podcast, hindsight is really easy, but at the point Sony embarked on making the Da Vinci Code, there was still the doubt about whether this would cross over into hit movie territory. I mean, already by this point, the book was attracting some controversy, not because of the quality of it, but by nature of the religious elements within the story. And it would be fair to say that there was some concern, really, about bringing this to the big screen. Sony wasn't utterly sure that it was going to have a massive hit on its hands. So what they decided to do pretty much up front was develop this as a standalone film, that even though there was a pre-existing novel, and it was well known that Dan Brown was going to move on to do another novel as well, they were going to treat it as if it was a one-off film, and then if more of them came along, that's fine, they could work around that. But Goldsman's brief was go and write a script for the Da Vinci Code, and just the Da Vinci Code. Don't worry about tying it to anything else. So while he went off and did that, the casting work could get underway. Who was going to play this character, Robert Langdon? Well, it appeared that one of the first choices for him was the late, great Bill Paxton. And he was sounded out by Ron Howard about taking the role on. But Paxton at that point had a hit on the small screen, that he was front and centre of the acclaimed drama Big Love. And his commitment to that TV show meant that it was a non-starter, really, him being able to join the Da Vinci Code, even though it was going to be a prominent lead role. Ron Howard, of course, had a relationship with Russell Crowe as well. I mean, Cinderella Man, another of their unions. And so there was a point where it was rumoured that he was being sounded out. But he went back in the end to a regular collaborator for him, that Ron Howard had broken through into Hollywood off the back of Splash, starring Tom Hanks. The pair had an enormous success with Apollo 13, of course, and the part of Robert Langdon was duly offered to Tom Hanks, who accepted. I mean, this was going to be a nice, expensive movie, a good payday for all concerned. They were going to be able to go all around the world with the film. Sony was stumping up $125 million for the budget, and this was not a special effects driven film either. So this was a chance to do a big summer hit. And so Hanks was on board. Audrey Tautou was less inclined to join up in the first instance. She had to be persuaded to audition for her role in the film, and in the end she did so, but she'd initially been worried that she was a little too young for the part. That the rest of the ensemble soon fell into place. Jean Reno would come on board, Paul Bettany, Alfred Molina, Ian McKellen, and it's the kind of project that just attracted a high-profile cast. One of the people who was attracted to it as well was Ricky Gervais, and he was offered the role of the butler, he would go on and tell the Daily Mirror. And he explained to Ron Howard, he said, "I will ruin your film." And he said, "The number of times I sat down for a great film by a great director and a British actor pops up and ruins it for me. I don't want to be that bloke," explained Ricky Gervais as he turned the film down. Still, there were enough people who did sign on the dotted line, and after extensive pre-production and location scouting as well, filming could begin on the Da Vinci Code on the 5th of July 2005. So again, another relatively swift film story we're dealing with here. And also, there aren't that many film stories that I tell that feature Tom Hanks taking his trousers off in front of the real Mona Lisa painting in the Louvre in Paris. But here we are. We're all here. Let's tell that story, because as Hanks explained to the New York Times in a relatively recent interview, he spent his 40-somethingth birthday, his words, he said, "We were shooting in the Louvre at night. And he said, I changed my pants," and I think he means in the American sense rather than the British sense, "in front of the Mona Lisa." He said, "They brought me a birthday cake in the Grand Salon. Who gets to have that experience?" He said, "Any cynicism there? Hell no." Because the production was one of the rare ones, and not the only one, that did indeed get access to the Louvre in Paris. But one of the conditions of working in of shooting in such a famous museum was you had to do so under tight restrictions. So the filmmakers filmmakers could only work when out of hours. So when the museum was open, they weren't allowed in there. But also the exhibits in the Louvre, not least the Mona Lisa itself, were sensitive. So it meant light wasn't allowed to be shone on the picture, for instance. And there is a moment in the film where light is indeed shone on the picture. And so what they did was they had to build a replica of that. And so in tandem with shooting on location in Paris, the film also went to Malta as well as around the UK, I'll come to shortly, parts of the Louvre were rebuilt in London, where the production was set up at Pinewood Studios, an assortment of sound stages put together, including this recreation that they could use. Now, not every location was particularly welcoming to the Da Vinci Code, because already the controversy and the religious aspects of the book were causing pushback. So the filmmakers, for instance, got a firm no from Westminster Abbey, for example, and so instead they decamped to a cathedral in Lincoln that was a bit more welcoming. The film ended up in places like Croydon, in Leicestershire, in Paris, and presumably much to the relief of Sony and to the filmmakers itself. It was a fairly straightforward shoot. It was quite a lengthy one. It wouldn't wrap up until the 12th of October 2005. But considering all the worries about protests that they were having and some of the, just some of the concerns, there was, they got the film in the can on time. They'd done a bit of work on the 007 stage at Pinewood as well as using, in fact, Pinewood's underwater stage for some key sequences in the movies, and that underwater stage has stories and a half of its own. But the bottom line here was the film was in the can, and so then it was a case of how do you go about promoting it? How do you go about pushing this particular production, which Sony had earmarked for a high summer release, May the 19th, 2006, the start of summer blockbuster season 2006, really, or just a couple of weeks into it. The plan too was to take the movie to the Cannes Film Festival and premiere it there a day or two in advance. But already the controversy was starting to rumble ahead of that. I mean, there's a story that one of the locations that took money for the filming of the Da Vinci Code, Winchester Cathedral in the UK, took £20,000 from Sony to allow filming, and it used that money to pay for an exhibition in the cathedral that was a rebuttal of the book, that as much as the money was useful just in the upkeep of the running costs of the church, of the cathedral itself, they diverted some of the funds to criticising the thing that they'd taken the money for in the first place. And this was, this was just a small part of the problem that Sony was balancing here. And I found an article over at NPR, which I thought was really interesting, about some of the experiments that Sony was doing with advertising for the Da Vinci Code, because conscious that the film was a magnet for controversy, this was also the point where people's enthusiasm for the book, certainly in a critical sense, was starting to wane, in much the same way that, say, 50 Shades of Grey got an influx of people interested in it. It then also got an influx of people saying it's a load of rubbish. A similar thing was happening with the text of the Da Vinci Code as well. And what Sony was doing was it was testing models whereby if it spent more money advertising the film, would that have a positive or a negative effect? And it came to the conclusion that the more it was going to spend and the more it was going to try and raise the profile of the movie, the less it was going to take at the box office, that they were potentially oversaturating the marketing of the film, and so they needed to be careful and actually dial it back a little bit. Also, presumably in the minds of executives at Sony somewhere along the line are the problems that Universal Pictures had with a similar religious hot potato movie, The Last Temptation of Christ, back in the 1980s, the Martin Scorsese movie. And the backlash of that was enormous. You get on the wrong side of the church and of religious groups, and you risk boycotts, you risk backlash. And in the case of The Last Temptation of Christ, a slaughtered pig was sent through the post to the then Universal chief, Sid Sheinberg, as well as photographs were taken of his home as well, and he got notes from people. This was in the pre-digital era as well, saying, "We know where you live." And so what Sony decided to do with the Da Vinci Code was play this down a little bit, to go light initially on critic screenings, although there was arguably another reason that it might choose to do that, and to give the film its debut at the Cannes Film Festival and then open it wide just a couple of days later. Even at the Cannes Film Festival, producer Brian Grazer would talk about how interviews were cancelled fairly late in the day because, again, they just didn't want to flood the media with chat about the Da Vinci Code. They got the profile they needed for it. Now that it was just a case of fingers crossed, will people come in? And Sony also wasn't avoiding the religious controversy of this too, to the point where it set up a website. So, its intent was that religious leaders could be engaged with what it was trying to do and to have a debate about the film. And Sony would describe this as, quote, an opportunity for dialogue. More cynical people would perhaps suggest it would be an opportunity to help with the commercial prospects of the film, because ultimately all of these efforts were towards selling tickets. Now, Ron Howard, for his part, he was more than happy to lean into the controversy of it. I mean, he would talk to Entertainment Weekly and say it would be ludicrous to take on this subject and then try to take the edges off. And Howard would explain that with the film version that they're doing the movie because they like the book and they're not going to shave those edges off the book and they're just going to go for it. And so that perhaps explains, I mean, it's fairly loyal to the book, and that explains the 2.5 hour running time of the movie. And so it went before critics for the first time at the Cannes Film Festival. That was the plan. And the critical response to the movie, well, it wasn't great. I mean, just to give you a flavour of it, I would say it was more on the piddly side, that there were lots of critics coming out and just going on about this is just an overblown bore. There were some people who were just a little more receptive to it as a summer film with a really daft plot. Tom Hanks had a haircut in it. I read that in one of the reviews. That was a slight revelation to me, but a dull film. Tended to be just a general snapshot of the critical response that was coming in. But would that make any difference when audiences were given access to the film and were in the queue? And would they buy their tickets? And what do you know? Did they buy their tickets? They bought lots of them. Now, the first of the big blockbusters of summer 2006 had led to cause to concern. That was Mission Impossible 3, that was underperforming a little bit against expectations. No such worries at all with the Da Vinci Code, which opened that weekend, the 19th to the 21st of May in the US, with an incredible $77 million opening weekend. And what's also incredible about that is another film had a massive opening, the hugely underappreciated animated movie Over the Hedge from DreamWorks. That got 38 million in the bank that weekend as well, even with Mission Impossible claiming 8 figures on its third week. The blockbusters kept coming that summer, though. The week after X-Men The Last Stand hit and opened with $102 million, the Da Vinci Code held up quite well, though. It dropped 55% in its second weekend, but that's better than most blockbusters tend to do. Held on to second place. The Breakup arrived the week after and helped itself to nearly 40 million of business, but the Da Vinci Code was still hanging in there. And as much as the word of mouth on the film was not massively positive, this was a film aimed at a slightly older audience at a point where the other films coming in, I mean, Cars came out the week after, the Omen remake came out, weren't really targeting that particular sector of the audience. So the Da Vinci Code hung around for probably a little while more than you might think. I mean, the Fast and Furious Tokyo Drift came out the weekend. That was doing good business. Adam Sandler included. But the bottom line was it was in the top 10 for the best part of 2 months. And by the time it left American cinemas, $217 million had been banked for this critically panned film. Overseas, over $500 million banked, 542 million, for a total worldwide gross of $760 million. Now, the response to the film, however, was still causing a few headaches. I mean, fortunately, the Vatican took the release of the movie in a very measured and calm way. So Cardinal Francis Arinze, for instance, well, he suggested legal action against the film. Archbishop Angelo Amato asked that the Da Vinci Code just be boycotted. The film was banned in many countries. Its release was delayed in many countries as well. There were protests organised against it on the grounds of blasphemy, and the problems surrounding it were following it. And it was a year after the release that there was for a moment a very real chance that the filmmakers could go to prison for making the Da Vinci Code. And this came about because of a group of Catholic clergy in a small village in Italy, some 40 miles north of Rome, the members of those clergy got in touch with the area state prosecutor, and the area state prosecutor, as Film Review magazine reported in its August 2007 issue, agreed to open an investigation based on Article 528 of Italy's Penal Code. So this complaint came in about over a year after the film's release, at a point where Sony was fast-tracking the next film in the series, Angels and Demons. And crucially, the filmmakers were looking to go to Italy to film Angels and Demons as well, so they needed those permissions. But in the summer of 2007, there was it was reported around the world by Reuters, is where I got some of this from as well, that Ron Howard, Dan Brown, Brian Grazer potentially were going to have jail time for making the film. That this apparently blasphemous film was in breach of laws, and they were in trouble. And so, but the news quickly spread around the world, and like many news stories, it had a 24-hour cycle to it, because eyebrows were initially raised. The fact it took a year to raise the complaint against the film. And even the local state prosecutor seemed a bit puzzled about that, to the point where an unnamed official in the state prosecutor's office would suggest to Reuters that the offended members of the clergy may only have just got round to seeing the film, and arguably they just hadn't seen the film. All of which was a bit grist to the mill, really, and the case disappeared almost before it started, although it was great headlines for a while. And for Sony, it was able to press ahead with the next book in the series, and it brought back Ron Howard, and it brought back Tom Hanks, and it brought back the core cast for Angels and Demons. Now, that one was originally a prequel, effectively, to the Da Vinci Code. Well, it was the first story. It was set before the Da Vinci Code. Angels and Demons was retooled to be a follow-on to the Da Vinci Code. I think it's the better film. I think Angels and Demons is an absolute hoot. I think the Da Vinci Code, in truth, is a bit of an insomnia cure, but, you know, one that's enjoyed by many people, so who am I to sneer at that? But also, what the film was the latest example of what happens when a Hollywood movie studio looks to make a film that's in and around the world of religion. Because as much as the stakes were high financially with the Da Vinci Code, and as much as the rewards were high, there was a lot of pushback. There was a lot of nuance, in particular to the marketing and the promotion of the film. And while Sony got away with it and managed to bank the best part of $1 billion in truth, it's telling that the later films in the series, it took a while till Inferno came along, never quite reached that level of popularity. Perhaps people had seen the first one by now. And even Tom Hanks would reflect more recently to the New York Times when considering the films. He said that was a commercial enterprise. He said those Robert Langdon sequels are hooey, he said. The Da Vinci Code was hooey. Who am I to argue with the Hanks? And that brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you for listening and thank you for your time. If I've not bored you to death, you can find more from me on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can find more from the entire Film Stories project on Twitter as well, at Film Stories. We're on Facebook, facebook.com/Film Stories Online. We're on YouTube at youtube.com/Film Stories. The Film Stories website is filmstories.co.uk, cunningly. It's updated every weekday with news, reviews, features, mayhem, all sorts of things going on there. The Film Stories shop is store.filmstories.co.uk. Now, you'll find there, over 50 different issues of our assorted magazines, Film Stories and Film Junior magazine, a new one going on sale shortly. And the Patreon, again, if you want to support us there, is patreon.com/Simon Brew. I'm now off to finish one or two special episodes of Film Stories that are going to be heading your way over the coming weeks. The most important thing, as always, is that you all stay well. You all take care of yourselves. I'll be back soon with some more Film Stories. Until then, you all take care. Bye-bye.